So our next speaker is the Honorable Ben Nighthorse Campbell, U.S. Senator, retired from and he's Northern Cheyenne, on the memorialization of Sand Creek.
Thank you. Before I make my comments, and I will have to abbreviate those because so many speakers have already said some things I would have liked to touch on, but coming from Colorado, I'm very appreciative of the people of Colorado that elected me to office so many times, but I think sometimes too it's kind of a poetic justice that a descendant of Sand Creek could be elected in a state where it happened. And that, I suppose, is part of the healing process, and I was very grateful to represent Indian country and our state at the same time. And I think I might also tell you, since nobody has spoken on it very much, about this wonderful venue that we're in today. I think it was the first bill I introduced when I first was elected to Congress years and years ago, and Senator Dan Inouye, who was the prime sponsor on the Senate side, needed a House sponsor. I became that House sponsor. And right from the beginning, we didn't want it to be a place that simply stored old baskets and pots in glass cases. We wanted it to be an interactive building, and if you saw all those children outside during our lunch break, we've certainly accomplished that goal. Not just Native American kids, but kids from every walk of life in many foreign countries as well as the United States. And this wonderful institution, as you know, they give lectures on song and dance and crafts. They have the food here. They give rotating displays. They have people from all over the world that come to study the American Indian, us. But Dan Inouye used to say years ago that this city, Washington, D.C., is a city of monuments, but as Dan said, there's not one monument to the American Indian. We think this is our monument, and the proximity to the Capitol itself gives it terrific access to the crowds of people that come to Washington. We're delighted to have them come here and learn about our ways. I am often very envious of Norma and Henrietta and Dick Little Bear, having been raised at home where they could spend time with their grandmothers and grandfathers and learn the language. I didn't have that option because my dad left the res to go into World War I and didn't go back. And I used to ask him why he left. He said, I got tired of being hungry, and he didn't want to talk about it very much. So things must have been really difficult. They're difficult right now on some of the northern reservations that have a high suicide rate among teenagers or a high school dropout rate or sometimes a 70% unemployment rate. I don't need to tell my Indian relatives in here all those things that we face, I mean almost as a daily existence on many of the reservations in the north. But still, when I hear them speak our language, and no, I can't, I'm envious of that. And every 2 weeks when I get our little tribal newspaper, and there's a story in there about Cheyenne language by Dr. Little Bear, I try desperately to pronounce some of those words, and I'll tell you, unless you're raised by a grandmother, it's a darn difficult thing to do. Well, in any event, we call this our house. And I was honored to be the House sponsor to build it, and I got an awful lot of help. Norma mentioned Lee Lone Bear and a number of other people, Steve Brady and Laird Kometseva from Southern Cheyenne, and so many others helped me and gave me advice when I was going to introduce the first bill that they had written a draft for. But my personal interaction with the Sand Creek Massacre site goes back before that. First time I visited it was about 1978, something like that, about in the late 70s. And I remember at the time, I almost couldn't find it because there was just a little dirt road going into a ranch, and on that dirt road, after you left the main highway, I think it was County Road 96 over there by Eads, Colorado, there was a stone monument, maybe 2 or 3 feet square, and that was all there was at the time. And I thought about it then, that there had to be some better way to commemorate that terrible tragedy. When I was elected to the state legislature in 1982, I went to the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs, and I asked them if they would head up a effort to put a sign there so people that drove down that road could read at least the Cheyenne and Arapaho story about what happened. And so with their help, we did that. We contacted Northern Cheyenne and Arapahoes and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapahoes, and we got some tentative language that they would have wanted on that sign. That sign was erected on the highway and stood for, I think it was probably there for 20 or more years before it finally rotted away. And so I guess I was kind of a late comer to some of the efforts, but then when I got elected to Congress, it was one of the first things on my mind to try to make some kind of a permanent place there where Cheyenne people could go and the rest of the world could learn about the Sand Creek Massacre. I wanted to, before I read an editorial from the Rocky Mountain News, I've often asked myself, how could a Cheyenne and Arapaho group, which were warrior societies, how could they be taken by surprise when normally they had camp guards, normally they were very alert, and it just surprised me that they've sort of been snuck up on, you might say, by Shivington's men. One of the reasons, of course, was the picture behind me that emissaries from General Wynkoop had told Black Kettle if he flew the American flag and a white flag that he wouldn't be attacked. So I think that sort of lulled him into complacency. Maybe the second reason was that already, somebody gave me this book a little while ago, already American Indians were serving in the U.S. military. This was about the ones that were clear back in the Civil War. But in fact, American Indians were, helping feed General Washington when he was stranded by Valley Forge. They were with Teddy Roosevelt when he stormed San Juan Hill. And everybody has heard about the Code Talkers, the Navajo Code Talkers, the Comanche Code Talkers, the Sioux Code Talkers, and so on. So maybe there was some feeling of let your guard down a little bit because Indian people in those days, many of them knew others were in the military. And I think the third reason they might have been somewhat complacent because some Cheyennes had wives, some white settlers also had Cheyenne wives. Prowers County, Colorado was named for a well-known rancher in those days who had a Cheyenne wife. And of course, everybody knows about William Bent, the founder of what is called Bent's Fort near La Junta, Colorado, whose Cheyenne wife, Owl Woman, had 5 children, as I remember, 4 boys and a girl. 2 of those boys were at Sand Creek. One, I think, was Charles, managed to escape with his life, and some accounts say the other boy was killed at Sand Creek. I think that because they had white relatives, there might have been some letting their guard down or thinking that those people understand us or something. Maybe nobody will know the complete truth about why they were taken by surprise, but it certainly did happen. Well, much of the language of the bill, of course, was written by the Descendants group, and Steve Brady, Otto Braided Hair, and Laird Comitseva from Oklahoma came to testify for us. But there's also unsung heroes, you might say, whenever you pass any bill. The guy carrying the bill, i.e. the congressman or the senator, often gets credit for doing it, but so many other people make it work. And in my case, I had a terrific staff. And many of the staff themselves, James Doyle, who now works for the Park Service in Colorado, for the National Park Service, represented me at all of the meetings between the Northern and the Southern tribes and the park officials too. And James Dean, who was on my staff here in Congress, he did much of the kind of networking with other offices to get co-sponsors and to try and make sure the bill moved. So a lot of people that deserve the credit are kind of unsung heroes. Let me skip around a little bit since a lot of things I had wanted to say have already been covered. But let me read the editorial that was written just a couple days after November the 29th of 1864 by the largest newspaper in the whole Rocky Mountain region, which was the Rocky Mountain News. It was before the Denver Post came along. The Rocky Mountain News was absorbed by the Denver Post a few years ago, but in those years, that was the most widely read newspaper. And I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs, and I quote, "Among the brilliant feats in arms in Indian warfare, the recent campaign of our Colorado volunteers will stand in history with few rivals and none to exceed it in final results. Whether viewed as a march or a battle, the exploits have few, if any, parallels. All acquitted themselves well, and the Colorado soldiers have again covered themselves with glory." The word should have probably been gory, but it was glory. No mention, of course, of the number of soldiers that were literally twice the number, if not more, than all of the Cheyennes that had been camped there, and probably 4 times the number of the ones that were actually in camp, since some of the warriors had been out hunting and were not in camp, and the ones remaining were women and children and some of the elders and just a few warriors. And no mention at all of the conditions that they were there in the first place, which was really because of General Wincoup's direction. So a lot of the things that they could have said positively, they did not. It's already been said that the two people that finally broke the true news, which was Silas Soule and Lieutenant Kramer, that Silas Soule, it was mentioned that he was killed. Those people were never brought to justice, never even tried, and were clearly supporters of Chivington who wanted to shut up any alternative comments being made to the investigating committees. The Department of Army had an inquiry, and I think there was something like 3 or 4 different congressional hearings in the Senate and the House. But those things were never implemented. And sometimes I wonder how come they were not brought to trial, some kind of a military tribunal or something. Because I'm old enough to remember what happened in Southeast Asia, what was called the My Lai Massacre. And when they find out some Americans murdered people in Vietnam, well, killed them, and depending on how you phrase it, they were brought to justice years later. And it seemed to me that there should have been something in retrospect to bring those people to justice. They weren't. They got off scot-free. And I don't exactly know why, except I know in those days, when people were brought into the military, it was usually for 100 days. It wasn't for a long duration like it is now, 2 years to 4 years. If you join the Air Force or Navy, it's 4 years. It was 100 days. By the time I think people began to focus on what ought to be done, these guys were gone. Most of them were gone. A lot of them had been brought in on this 100-day enlistment, had mustered out. They were gone off to new gold fields, or they were buffalo hunters and traveling and finding the final buffalo that they haven't been able to kill, or something. They were simply gone. And so they never were brought to justice. But in my view, I imagine the perpetrators of those terrible crimes are still burning somewhere where they ought to be burning. And nothing is written about why they weren't brought to justice. In fact, nothing is written except with the exception of a few people that brought it out today, that repatriations were never, ever paid to the Cheyennes for those terrible deeds. They pretty much got away scot-free. We often talk about healing wounds, and we use the word healing quite often after terrible tragedies, and I believe that. I think time takes care of a lot of that. In most cases, wounds are healed, but, you know, scars are never forgotten. And in my view, the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, for time immemorial from now on, will always bear those scars, and we'll always hear those stories. It's one of the first stories you hear. I remember after we passed the legislation, it took 7 years. You know, sometimes people think, well, if you introduce a bill, it gets done and there's no problem, and, you know, you pass it and it's signed into law the next day or a few days later. It's not. It takes a lot of negotiating, and there was a lot of negotiating done. We had to involve the Park Service. We had to involve all 4 of the tribes. We had to involve the state of Colorado. We had to involve many, many other agencies. And so the first bill really turned out to be a study bill, to study if it should be done at all. To get that bill passed and kind of networked, it took almost 2 years. And then we had to introduce the second bill. As Norma mentioned, there were 3 bills. We had to do the second one to actually do it. And during that time, there was a lot of negotiations, and there had to be environmental impact statements done. There had to be everything you can think about. And one of the problems that arose during those times of negotiating with all the different people who had a vested interest or a seat at the table, as you might say, was the fact that oral tradition did not jibe with written documentation by the government. And a lot of people thought, well, you could pinpoint where the killing was, and it must have been right over here by those campfires or right over here, when in fact, we later found out it wasn't. It was a total of about 6 miles long. There were people running and hiding and trying to bury themselves by caving earth in on top of them on the banks of the creek, any number of things. And so what we finally decided to do was, rather than trying to focus on exactly where it was, this campfire or that teepee ring or so on, we'd take in a larger area and try to encompass the whole thing, and then later decide exactly what happened where. And that's basically what happened with the final bill. That's the way it was done. There were really 3 landowners involved, and the largest number of acreage, about 1,400 acres or a little more, was owned by a family by the name of Dawson. Years before, when I was elected to the state legislature, and I wanted to do something about that land, we approached the Dawson family to see if they would sell that land to the state so we could make some kind of a state commemorative park out of it for the Cheyenne and Arapaho, but the Dawson family did not want to sell it in those early 80s, and I've never been a big believer of condemning private land for government use, so I didn't pursue it after that. But this time around, there was a little more interested by the Dawson family. But some of the battle site, the killing fields, as I think we ought to call them, was on other landowners' places too. The federal government, when they buy land, they can only buy at what is called fair market value. They take a survey of other land around it, and they found out what it was sold for, and that's by law all they can offer you for your land if it happens to be in the proximity of the land that's already sold. Well, a couple of the other landowners, at least one of the other landowners, said that would be okay, and we managed to get that land bought, the Park Service did. But the Dawson family felt that since theirs was the primary location of most of the terrible, tragic killings, their land should be worth more, and he was probably right. From a historic standpoint, it was probably worth more. And so the federal government couldn't pay all the money that he wanted for that land, but thanks to I forgot his first name, Mr. Druck, who is really a principal behind some of the business concern the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho have, they came to our aid and came up with the extra money that we needed to buy that land from the Dawson family. And so it's an ongoing thing. There's an interpretive center there now, as you probably know, and I remember visiting Bent's Fort, which is, I think, about an hour away, as I remember now, from the Sand Creek Massacre site, some years ago, and I asked him if many people came through there and asked about Sand Creek, and they said it was the single thing most of their visitors asked for. Where's Sand Creek? People that had read about it, didn't know anything about it, they wanted to know where Sand Creek is, and now they know. When we went there for you might say, the ribbon cutting a few years ago, there was a huge contingent, as you might guess, of Indian people, and if you've gone there, it's about 10 miles away from a little small farming town by the name of Eads, E-A-D-S, Eads, Colorado. We went into Eads to get lunch one of the days we were there, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see the reception the people in that county in Eads gave to the Cheyenne and Arapaho people that came back for you might say, the ribbon cutting and the ceremony of opening it to the public. There were signs and writing on the windows of the stores that welcome back Cheyennes, welcome back Arapahos. And it was in English, but it was also in Cheyenne or Arapaho. And what interested me, one of my Cheyenne friends was kind of laughing at one of the signs in the window, and I said, why? And they said, well, because whoever told them welcome back, they misspelled it. So they had it wrong, but at least their heart was in the right place and their intention was the right place. They also did a big barbecue, and the tribes provided the buffalo, but they invited everybody from the area to come to that. And it was really a welcome sight to see the non-Indian people of that area that were so open-hearted. And many of them came up to me, and I know many of them came up to my Cheyenne relatives to thank us for coming back and thank us for doing what we did in establishing that as a national historic monument. Now, when I introduced those bills, we got we got all three of them passed after 7 years, actually 6 years on my side. But after we got it past the Senate, the final version of it, it was not signed into law yet, it still had to go by the House. Bills have to go through both houses. There was a Congress lady that only did, I think, 1 or 2 terms from southeast Colorado, and since I had already announced I was not going to run again, I thought a lot of my job was pretty well done with this magnificent structure, and introducing that Sand Creek bill and getting it passed, I had announced I was going to retire. Nobody had to throw me out. I knew the way home, and I was getting pretty homesick after 22 years. And so we got it past the Senate, and I announced I was not going to run again, and darned if our House counterpart didn't drop the ball and didn't even pursue getting the bill passed on the outside, and so it died. Fortunately, Senator Wayne Allard, who was my colleague when I was in and was still serving after I left, picked up the ball, took our language, and since the hearings had already been done, he reintroduced it, and it literally flew through that time, and the congresswoman who was on the other side, she had kind of got scalded by her local press and by some of the towns in the southeast Colorado for not pursuing that bill and not getting it passed, and so she did then, and it was signed into law. So I'm just very proud of the fact that so many people worked so hard on that to get it passed, and particularly all those unsung heroes that you don't read about very much that were really instrumental. I remember Lee Lone Bear telling me many times, in fact, one of the last times that he talked to me a little bit about was the morning when we had kind of the ribbon cutting of Sand Creek, and he he was doing an early morning sweat and prayer ceremony, and afterwards I talked to him a little bit, and Lee, of course, was a direct descendant of Black Kettle. And he told me a little bit about some of the old chiefs that were killed there. As you know, Black Kettle wasn't, but it was surprised on the Washita some years later by General Custer. That story's already been told by an earlier speaker, but a number of others, Chief Warbonnet, just 2 years before, according to Lee, he had been in Washington, D.C. with a delegation and met with either the president or some of the emissaries of the president to try to work out some kind of an equitable peace agreement. But of course, in those peace agreements in those days, they didn't last too long, and the federal government simply couldn't enforce them. When you had a western part of the United States that was growing so fast, with a huge influx of gold seekers. Gold was discovered in 1851 in Denver, and of course the people really came in there. It was after the California gold rush, and they were from all over the world looking for their fortunes there. There were the hide hunters, the trappers, you name it, the people that wanted to farm. Some didn't speak English, just got off the boat, wanted to move west. They heard Horace Greeley's words about "go west, young man," and then they did. There wasn't any way the federal government could control that. And certainly the territory of Colorado under then Governor Evans and the principals like Shivington, they were out from the very beginning to kill some Indians. I mean, they both said it several times over. There's never, ever been any proof at all that I know of that some of the depredations that were done by somebody were that band of Cheyenne, let alone any Cheyenne or any other tribe. There was one family that was called the Hungate family that was killed a few months before the Sand Creek Massacre, and it has never been proven by anybody that the people that killed that family were even Indian, let alone Cheyenne Indians. And yet around the streets of Denver it was bandied around, particularly among the unwashed that were there, that it must have been the Cheyennes. And so they had this terrific hype and this negative stereotyping and this anger and hate built up by frustrated people that hadn't found gold or couldn't kill enough buffalo or something to lash out at somebody. And of course, we've seen that happen in other parts of the world at other times. I mean, that's what Adolf Hitler was all about. And as Norma said, you know, now is the time we focus on trying to make sure something like that could never happen again. But in fact, my friends, it not only could happen again, it is happening again. Look what's happening right now in Iraq and Afghanistan and some other places with the rise of ISIS and some of these other hate groups that are simply out to kill anybody who does not believe with their ideology. It can happen again. Not so easy in this country, I think, because I think most of Americans now think pretty independently. But it's just tragic that not enough people learn from those terrible tragedies. And of course, that's what the bills were supposed to be all about, and that's what this forum is all about too, I think, to try to carry that message a little bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Campbell.